Changing Hearts and Minds About Animals and Food. That was published in 2008 by Touchstone, and it has appeared in a Los Angeles Times and the Boston Globe as a bestseller. So help me welcome Jim Baur.
Great, thank you very much. It is wonderful to be here to see the crowds and the vegan food out there and the growing awareness about these issues. Now, how many of you here are vegan? The vast majority. Well, that's great. It's very cool to be here as vegan and to know we don't have to ask about the food just to go and eat anything else. And for those of you who are here and are not vegan, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your curiosity and interest in a different kind of food system. You know, like most people, I grew up eating meat and dairy and eggs, and like most people, I didn't really think that much about it. Everybody around me was eating that way, and so I just adopted the habit. And if you think about it, most people grow up that way, eating animal foods without thinking very much about it. We just do it because it's the norm, and everybody around us is doing it, so we think it's appropriate. But as time went, for me, I started thinking about it and recognizing that I didn't have to eat animal foods, and that I could be very healthy by eating only plant foods. And so in 1985, I went vegan. It's one of the best decisions I've ever made, and I've been a vegan since. And early on, you know, I was very much oriented as an ethical vegan, and I still am. But I wasn't as mindful about eating good, healthy food. I never had any big health problems, but when my first book came out a couple years ago, people would ask me what I ate. And I would, you know, boil a big pot of noodles over the weekend and put it in the fridge, and during the week I'd grab a handful, put it on a plate, put it with, you know, margarine and salt in the microwave and zap it, and that was lunch. So people would ask me, well, what do you eat? And I would say, well, I take these noodles, and I would describe it. And people started looking at me with kind of a little bit of a sideways glance, saying, you know, you need to represent a little bit better than that. So I've made a conscious effort over the past few years of eating healthier and being an example of a healthy vegan. And I've also started doing marathons and triathlons to demonstrate that vegans can do this stuff. So I've done 4 marathons over the past few years, including Boston earlier this year. And I also have done a number of triathlons, including an Ironman, which involves swimming 2.4 miles, biking 112, and then running a marathon. So did all that as a vegan. And I've also come to meet a number of other vegan elite athletes, people like Rich Roll, who's done the Ultraman triathlon, which is a double Ironman. And he's a vegan, and he wrote a book about it called Finding Ultra. Scott Jurek spoke at our farm last month. He's an ultra marathoner. He wins 100-mile races. He won the Western States 100 7 times in a row as a vegan. He also won the Spartathlon a couple of times, which is a 156-mile race as a vegan. And then last year I was up in Canada, and Patrick Babuyan, who's one of these strongman guys, you know, like pushes cars and lifts up things and pushes big tires. He recently broke a world record for carrying the most weight any human being has ever carried. And he's a vegan. So vegans have the endurance, they have the strength, so we can get everything we need on a plant-based diet. And I just mention this because we grow up being bombarded with messages about how we need to eat meat for protein. You know, we've heard this over and over again. And as a longtime vegan, when people learn that I don't eat meat, they often say, well, where do you get your protein, right? A lot of us have heard this over and over. And it's easy to kind of go, duh, I mean, we've heard that tons of times. But for people, that's a real question, because they've been bombarded with this idea you need meat for protein. And so it is important to be able to say you can get protein from tofu, from soy milk, tempeh, from beans. There are various ways to get protein, and what I was just mentioning are very high sources of protein. But you can also get protein in potatoes and broccoli and just whole grains. Protein is everywhere. quinoa is a really good source of protein too. So just letting people know that there are ways to get protein. And as a vegan, a big part of what I think is important is to accept people where they are on their own journeys and provide people with helpful, supportive information. So if somebody says, where do you get your protein? You know, tell them some of these sources. And then, of course, there's all kinds of meatless meats, too, like Gardein or Beyond Meat, or, there's different kind of veggie burgers and veggie dogs, which also have a lot of protein. So there's lots of good ways to get it. But I think it is important for us as vegans to recognize that a lot of people might be curious about this lifestyle, might be intrigued and interested in it, and it's very important for us to be patient and understanding and respectful that sometimes people aren't going to change overnight. And I think one of the big obstacles to change is fear. People are afraid, I'm not going to get my protein. That's why they ask that. Another of the things people are afraid of is other nutrients like calcium. We're bombarded with this crazy notion that we need to drink cow's milk to get calcium so we don't get osteoporosis. Now, in our country, we drink a lot of cow's milk, and we also get a lot of osteoporosis. So if drinking cow's milk prevented osteoporosis, we shouldn't see it, but we do. So the bottom line is we can get calcium through leafy greens, through kale, things like this, and just helping people understand that you can get everything you need nutritionally by eating plants, and we do not need to eat animal foods. So if it is not necessary to eat animals, then it is a choice. And I often ask, if we can live well and be happy without causing harm, why wouldn't we? And it's pretty hard to say, well, we want to cause harm. Most people don't want to cause harm. We are hardwired to have empathy. So if we see somebody else hurt, we feel something. During the Salem witch hunts, when the executioners were killing witches, in quotes, they were told, don't look into the eyes of the witches, because if you do, they will cast a spell on you and you won't be able to kill them. Obviously, you look into the eyes, you look into the face, you see the individual there, you empathize with them, and then you won't be able to kill them. At Farm Sanctuary, we rescue animals who have come from factory farms, and we encourage people to look into their eyes and to recognize that they are individuals. They are not that different than cats and dogs. We have turkeys, for example, who like people so much that they will come up and sit on your lap. We had this one turkey, Lydia, we called the hugging turkey, because she'd go out in the barnyard and sit down and she'd come and crane her neck around your neck and give you a hug. We have sheep who like to be petted, and so we'll pet them, and as we're walking away, they want us to keep petting them, so they'll start pawing like this, like a dog would paw, to say, don't go away, keep petting me. And pigs, for anybody who's been to one, how many of you have been to one of our farms? Okay, great. Well, for those of you who haven't, please come visit. For those of you who have, come back. We actually do our celebration for the turkeys every year in November, so that's coming up at our farm in Orland, California, not too far from here, where we feed the turkeys instead of eating them. They're guests of honor for Thanksgiving instead of the main course. So anyway, that's a fun event, and it's a great way to interact with animals in a positive way. But pigs, so if anybody who's been to our farms, many folks have a chance to give a pig a belly rub. And so we have these 500-pound pigs, and you walk up to them, you kind of touch their belly, and they'll flop over for a belly rub, and they'll grunt. As you're rubbing their belly, they'll be grunting, saying, yeah, keep doing that, keep doing that. So these animals are not that different than cats and dogs and other animals who many people live with. And why do we love some and eat others is a question too. And there's no real good answer to it. In some countries, they eat cats and dogs. And here, we're appalled by that idea. In some countries, they don't eat cows. So which animals we pet and which ones we eat are really arbitrary distinctions. And if we don't have to kill and we don't have to eat animal foods to be healthy, why would we? It's because we grow up with that habit. And then there are rationalizations that kick in because, as I mentioned, most people are humane. Most people don't like the idea of causing suffering, especially unnecessary suffering. So why do we eat meat? Well, as I mentioned, we need it for protein, which is not true, but that's one of the things we tell ourselves. We've always done it is another of the rationalizations. But over the course of human history, we've done a lot of things. And they've been institutions for thousands of years, things like slavery. And just because we've always done something doesn't mean that we should keep doing it. I think it's important to critically examine our behavior and then ultimately make choices that are aligned with our own values and aligned with our own interests. And again, I don't think there's too many people that would argue with that idea. So if we live in a way and eat in a way that's aligned with our own values, what does that look like? Well, when the issue of factory farming comes up, most people say, or not most, but a lot of people say, don't tell me, I don't want to know. It's too upsetting. I don't think that's a really good answer. I think it's important for people to be responsible. And if you're eating vegan, you don't have to say, don't tell me, I don't want to know. You are buying food from places that you are comfortable with. When you have children, for example, and you take them to a pick-your-own berry patch, it is a very different experience than taking your child, say, to a slaughterhouse. So which one of those feels better and is more aligned with our humanity and with our own values? It's going to get in those berries. And if you look at our biology, we are best suited to eat plant foods, not animal foods. Natural carnivores have a very long intestinal tract. Have a very short intestinal tract. And that's because meat is a putrefying flesh and it needs to get through the body very quickly. Now, human beings have a very long intestinal tract. So if we eat meat, it takes a long time to pass. And can you imagine what a putrefying piece of meat looks like after a couple of days in a 98.6 degree moist environment? It's not so good. And so we have things like colon cancer that are a result of our unhealthy food system and meat in our large intestine taking a long time to get out of there. So our bodies are not well suited to eat meat. We also are not inclined to salivate when we see a dead animal or an animal who's bleeding and injured. A carnivore would, because that's food. But we tend not to. Harvey Diamond wrote a book a number of years ago, I think it's called Fit to Live or something like that, but he advocated plant-based eating. And early on in it, there was this little story saying, if you take a child and put him in a room with an apple and a rabbit, and if he plays with the apple and eats the rabbit, I'll buy you a car. It's not what we're inclined to do. So if you look at our natures and our ethics and our values, most people are going to say they're against cruelty. They're against unnecessary suffering. And so if we want to live according to that value, certainly means we're not supporting factory farming, and could also mean we're not going to be eating animals that are killed if we don't have to. We also encourage people to make food choices that are aligned with our interests. And in our country today, we're eating food that makes us sick. Heart disease and cancer are the top two killers. Both of those, the risks of both, can be lessened significantly by shifting to a whole foods, plant-based diet. So it's completely irrational to eat food that makes us sick. How many of you have seen the film Forks Over Knives? Okay, a fair number. Great. It's an excellent film. I think it's one of the best, pointing out the benefits of plant-based eating. There are people that have had heart disease that are featured in the film who shift away from eating animal foods to eating plant foods, and their heart disease goes away. There's Dean Ornish has written on this for many years about reversing heart disease. And there are other doctors now starting to recognize the benefits of treating illnesses like this with medicine. Hippocrates years ago said, let food be thy medicine. Unfortunately, in the way we eat in this country, it's more like a poison. And so that is not in our interest. My father had a heart attack about 15 years ago now, and he was in the hospital, and they were feeding him bacon and eggs. It was stunning. So, I got on the phone, and I tried to talk to the doctor, who would not get on the phone, so I ended up talking to the nurse and saying, what is this, the come back and see us diet? What are you doing? And, my dad's a conservative guy, so he usually does what the doctor says. But the fact they were feeding him bacon and eggs caused him to start thinking, and he read Dean Ornish's book on reversing heart disease through plant-based eating, and he now eats he went vegetarian for a short time. It didn't stick, unfortunately, but he eats far fewer animal foods now than he did before. So, our food choices have consequences. And so it's not in our interest to eat food that makes us sick. Just also a little bit more I want to say on the medical industry. I mentioned my dad had a heart attack. I'm in my 50s now, and I hadn't been to a doctor in decades. And I figured, I'm getting older. I should go and see a doctor just to make sure everything's okay. So about 5 years ago, I went to see a doctor, and he just started asking me a bunch of questions about heart disease in the family. And I told him that my grandfather died of a heart attack. My father had had a heart attack. And before taking any tests or doing any examination, he said, well, I might want to put you on heart medication. I was stunned. So I left that hospital and didn't go back. And I went to another hospital and asked the doctor just to get my blood and tell me what it said. And so he took my blood and looked at all the measurements, and everything was in the normal range, except for one of the measurements, and that was the bad cholesterol, and it was below the low normal. So that was probably not a terrible thing. So bad has become normal in our factory farming system, in our food system, in our healthcare system. When you get to be a certain age, going on medication is just the norm. And if everybody around us is doing it, it's just what happens. But it doesn't have to be that way. And so if we eat in a way that is aligned with our interest, we don't have to deal with a lot of these health problems that have become the norm in our country. Also, eating in alignment with our interests means supporting an agricultural system that is not destroying the planet like animal agriculture does. The United Nations put out a report a couple years ago called Livestock's Long Shadow. And in that report, they talked about how the livestock industry is one of the top contributors to the most serious environmental problems we're facing on the planet, including the loss of biodiversity, the loss of scarce resources like water. And here in California, obviously, that's a very pressing issue right now. And animal agriculture is a huge contributor to climate change. It contributes more than the entire transportation industry. So you take all the cars, trains, boats, planes, they contribute less than animal agriculture. So it's good that people are changing how we drive or not driving or biking or walking or doing whatever, changing our light bulbs. But changing how we eat could have an even greater impact. And it is in our interest to live on a planet that is not being destroyed. Unfortunately, animal agriculture is very influential in Washington, D.C. and its state capitals and even internationally. It is subsidized, and that is how this industry is able to survive. Because if you look at it at face value, it is extremely inefficient and extremely costly. To raise animals for food, we need to harvest tons and tons and acres of crops. It makes a lot more sense to eat those crops directly instead of taking them and feeding them to animals, raising the animals, and then killing the animals. So we could feed 5 to 10 times more people by eating plant foods instead of animal foods. We could use a lot less water, in some cases 100 times less water, depending on the particular meat or plant-based food. Fossil fuels is a whole other area that is not looked at enough when it comes to the cost of our food system. There was a New York Times article a number of years ago called Rethinking the Meat Guzzler. And in it, the author compared the amount of fossil fuels needed for a meat meal versus a vegetarian meal. Found it took 16 times more fossil fuels for the meat meal. That's a whole nother cost. And needless to say, we go to some pretty extreme measures to get oil. And the animal farming business uses a lot of it. not only in terms of energy and transportation of grain and animals, but refrigeration at slaughterhouses, or refrigeration, after slaughter. And processing at slaughterhouses is very energy intense. Harvesting lots of grain takes a lot of energy. Another thing about slaughterhouses is they use lots and lots of water. One slaughterhouse can use 1.5 million gallons of water a day. So this is extremely wasteful. Some years ago, we were investigating a slaughterhouse in California that was killing young calves for veal. And they were actually using a hose to herd these calves into the kill pen. And I don't know this for a fact, but my speculation is that they were using that hose because they were using water. And agriculture, once it has an allotment, it wants to use it up, so it maintains its access to this water. And it's paying less than the market value. So this is an industry that has preferential access to scarce resources. It squanders these resources. It wastes these resources. And all of us suffer as a result. So that is also not in our interest. I think it's important to support a food system that does not destroy this planet. And sadly, with animal agriculture, it's subsidized by tax money. So we subsidize the production of cheap corn and soybeans, which is then used to feed animals. We subsidize the cleanup of pollution caused by these industrialized farms where you have animals confined by the thousands producing enormous amounts of manure. So taxpayers pay to clean that up. Then we have health problems. And if somebody can't afford those, and sometimes people go bankrupt because they can't afford them, but in other cases, tax money goes into helping sick people get well because they're eating and living in a way that's not very healthy. So these are all things that are not in our interest. And, when we look at the world and see all the harms, there's many things that are outside of our control that we can't really do very much about. But when it comes to the way we eat, that is something we have a lot more control over. So that is why I think this issue is so important and why it is something that people need to look at. We can be empowered to make choices that are aligned with our values and interests. We can be empowered to live well. And that's what events like this are about. And the good news is this kind of awareness is spreading all over the country. I was actually just in the South the last couple days, in Georgia and South Carolina, and there's, universities having talks about these issues. There are veg fests happening everywhere with lots and lots of people coming out. And there are small businesses popping up all over the place providing vegan food. So it's a really, I think, positive time to be vegan. It's never been so easy. As I mentioned, I went vegan in 1985. And at the time, for soy milk, we used to mix this powder with water. It was not that easy to find soy milk. Now, you go to the grocery store and you have soy milk and almond milk and coconut milk and health food stores, you go oat milk and hemp milk and hazelnut milk. And so many different kinds of varieties. So it's easier than ever. And there's more awareness than ever. People know about factory farming. Even people like Anthony Bourdain, who is certainly not a vegan and not really even animal friendly, has said, what happens on the factory farm borders on the criminal. So you have this widespread recognition that our food system as it currently exists is unhealthy and inhumane and is an affront to our humanity. And so people now are starting to think more about it, talk more about it, and people are sharing information. And this is another thing we have now that we have not had before. Things like Facebook and social networking and videos available on various websites, pictures that can be shared. And those pictures might be of the cruelty to help raise awareness about that, but they could also be of a great-looking vegan lasagna. So we can share information about what's wrong with factory farming and videotapes, pictures, and things like that. We can also share information about what you can do about it and how you can feel better about what you eat physically, but also emotionally. Because instead of saying, I don't want to know, you can say, I know where my food comes from and I feel good about it. I'm living in alignment. So that's the other thing that we have now, is this enormous resource. And I encourage people to take pictures of the booths here, take pictures and share the information that you, and the experience you're having here today. Because, we are social animals, and people see what other people do, and it tends to rub off. So the more people that live a vegan lifestyle, the more people there will be that will be interested and will start living a vegan lifestyle, because we rub off on those around us. And, that is, I think, a really critical fact that I've come to understand more and more over time, is just how social we are and how our behaviors impact others. And as a vegan advocate of many, many years, of nearly 30 years now, early on, I would sometimes get pretty angry about the fact that people were told what was happening and didn't change. The vegans have had a history of being a little bit finger wagging. And back in the day, I was a little bit of a finger wagger. But although I might be right that killing is wrong and you shouldn't do it, saying it that way is not very effective. And it's also not necessarily very respectful of your audience. And it doesn't recognize that each person has their own process. And at the end of the day, each person has to make their own food choices and make their own choices about how they live. And so it's important to respect that and to understand that. And then to support positive steps. So if somebody tells me that they don't eat veal anymore because they can't stand how those calves are put in the small crates, at one point I might have said, well, what about dairy? Veal comes from the dairy industry, which is true. But instead of that, now I'll say, well, that's great that you don't eat veal, and celebrate and support that step. I think if we walk side by side with others and see the world through similar eyes, it builds momentum for more changes. So if somebody stops eating veal, that is oftentimes the first step on a journey towards becoming vegan. For me, it was in high school, my grandmother told me how veal calves were raised. So I stopped eating veal. And over time, I started learning more about the food industry and decided to go vegan. So each time there's a small step made, I think it's worth celebrating and supporting, and then encouraging other steps as they come, because small steps lead to other small steps that ultimately lead to big changes. And in the food system now, the number of animals being killed in the U.S. has actually started going down for the first time, so that's pretty significant. There are more and more vegan restaurants and vegan companies. Around here, for example, you have Hampton Creek. Many of you probably know about, how many know about Hampton Creek? So fair enough. Hampton Creek is pretty amazing. They're making eggless mayonnaise. They're making it all from plant sources, and they're now in Target and lots of mainstream stores, and even in Walmart in some places. And their goal is to provide plant-based alternatives to egg products that are cheaper and healthier and require far fewer resources. There's another company called Beyond Meat that is doing the same thing with plant-based meat, where they are using soy protein and pea protein to make something that's a lot like chicken or beef. And people like Mark Bittman, the New York Times food critic, did a taste test. He could not tell the difference between the Beyond Meat chicken and real chicken. This product was also on the Today Show, and the host of the Today Show couldn't tell the difference between the Beyond Meat chicken and real chicken flesh. So you have these kind of products now that are developing. And you also have high-quality vegan restaurants and products. There's a chef, I don't know his name offhand, but he's like a high-end chef not far from here who's making a sushi out of tomatoes that apparently is very much like sushi. I've not tried it yet. I'm going to be getting a sample here pretty soon. They're here, I think, somewhere. I don't know where exactly, but they're out there. Okay, so I knew they were here. I haven't seen them yet, but so and these are like some high-end chefs now making vegan food for foodies. And we just had an event Farm Sanctuary did down at Crossroads Restaurant in LA. And Crossroads is like one of these, high-end, nice restaurants. when I was there a few months ago, all the paparazzi was around. I wondered what was going on. And it was, Kesha, she's like a celebrity. And so anyway, she was there. But the paparazzi is oftentimes outside of crossroads. And, so there's these, well-known people that go there and eat vegan food. And again, it's fancy, high-end vegan food. For a long time, I was always happy just to see the word vegan on a menu or hear that they have vegan food. But increasingly now I'm thinking, it also better taste good. Because there are times when somebody's curious about vegan food and they try it, and if it doesn't taste so good, they will possibly use that to say for the rest of their lives, I don't like vegan food, I tried it. So that's something also that in my own mind has been an evolution, that we need to be a positive example and the food needs to taste good, and people need to see that they're not giving up a whole lot. And there are prejudices out there. The thing about being vegan is that sometimes, I've talked to people who bring food to work or feed other people and they say, this is a vegan lasagna. By just saying, this is a vegan lasagna, sometimes it creates this impression in the mind of the person receiving the food that, oh, I'm not going to like it. It shouldn't be that way. But there are prejudices that still exist against vegan food. And so it's important to be mindful of those. And I think food still is a very important tool. Everybody has to eat. So bringing food to work, or even if there's a potluck that is not vegan, bring vegan food. Or even if there's a dinner party that you're going to that isn't vegan, bring vegan food. It is one of the best ways, I think, that we can reach people and show that this is not that hard. And in fact, it's tasty and it's nourishing. And you feel good about it in every way after you eat it. So this is a whole other area where there's a lot going on now. And the companies I mentioned before, Hampton Creek here in the Bay Area and Beyond Meat, they have some pretty significant venture capitalists investing in people, including people like Bill Gates. So there's a recognition that this is a future opportunity to be investing in these plant-based foods. And it makes sense from an ethical standpoint. People don't like cruelty. From a health standpoint, people, are healthier eating plant foods. From an environmental standpoint, and also from an economic standpoint. As I mentioned before, we use so many resources to produce animal foods, and we pollute the earth in such horrible ways. But so there's so many reasons. But people still tend to be able to rationalize and believe crazy stuff sometimes. I was speaking to a group of agribusiness people about our food system. And, I go in there and they know I'm a vegan. And I don't make any, I never try to hide that fact. In fact, I put it out there. But I still also try to find the common ground. And so when I'm talking to farmers, I will often say that we respect farmers, we appreciate that farmers work so hard and feed so many people. I mean, that's very admirable. And then I say, but the key question is, what is the best way for farmers to feed people? To make food accessible and healthy and affordable and produced efficiently? What is the best way to do that? And then I start talking about the waste associated with animal agriculture in terms of the grain that's wasted, the water, the land, fossil fuels. And so all these costs associated with it. And I make the case that the best type of agriculture is plant-based. We could feed far more people healthy food that would be wholesome and more accessible by growing plants instead of animals. And so I was making this point to a group of agribusiness people, and they kept coming back to me and saying, no, with the growing human population, the best way to feed the world is through intensive animal production. And I went back and said, all the data seems to suggest that it's plant agriculture. Where do you guys get your information? And after we went back and forth for a while, they told me the name of the book they got this from, and it was called Saving the Planet with Pesticides and Plastics. And that was actually the name of the book. So we human beings are capable of deluding ourselves into believing all kinds of stuff. You know, back when the abolitionists were fighting slavery, you know, there were arguments made. The majority of people thought this was a normal and an acceptable institution. And then as time went, it changed, and now it is universally opposed. Although there are still problems with slavery in our world. But at least we, human beings, now come to see this as inappropriate and unacceptable, and we shouldn't have it. So things do change. But in the meantime, there are these enormous capacities we have for rationalizing and deluding ourselves into believing that certain bad things are either necessary or somehow good things. And an example of this is in the pig industry, in the factory farming pig industry. One of our first visitors to the farm was a pig farmer who went into the barn and saw some of our volunteers taking care of these 500-pound sows. So these are really big animals. And this pig farmer was genuinely worried about the well-being of our volunteers. And he went into the barn and he told me, you know, you better get them out of there because those pigs are violent animals. They'll attack your people. And I told this pig farmer that, you know, often the animals are frightened when they first come here, but they learn to trust us after we treat them kindly. You know, before they come to us, whenever a human being approaches, they would be made to suffer. Pigs, for example, have their tails cut off. Chickens have parts of their beaks cut off. So whenever a person would approach them, it would mean pain. But at first, so they're afraid of us. But as time goes, they know they're in a safe place, and they don't attack us the way this pig farmer was saying. And he said, look, I've raised pigs for years. I know these animals, and you can't trust them. They're violent and aggressive, and they'll attack you. Trust me about it. So this is what this guy's telling me. And so and to illustrate his point, he told a story about how he had a sow who had babies, and he took her babies away, and she came after him. And this guy didn't even look at his own behavior. He used that to conclude that these animals are violent, aggressive animals, and you can't trust them. And it reminds me of that quote that we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so, anyway, you have this mindset that this pig farmer has. He feels entitled to these babies, doesn't even recognize that this animal has an opinion about the situation. And then what they do is they start putting them in crates so they can take the babies away more easily without the mother coming after them. So they now use these crates. But that's not all. They now have to justify why these crates are actually good for the animals. And the pig industry actually says these crates protect the babies from their mothers. That's why we use them. What a convoluted way of looking at that. But this is what they say. When we've worked on legislation to ban these small crates, they have actually argued in the media that these crates are used to protect the babies, which is completely bogus. And just to prove how bogus it is, there were these floods in Iowa a few years ago, and many of the pigs were in the crates and drowned. But there were some who escaped, including one who now lives at Farm Sanctuary. Her name is Julia. And she escaped, and she was on a levee, and she gave birth, and she was raising her young. So mother pigs know how to raise their babies, you know, unlike what this industry would say that they hurt their babies. And when we brought Julia to Farm Sanctuary, she came with her babies, and when we go in the barn with her, she doesn't attack us because we're going to take her babies away. She knows she's in a safe place, and she welcomes our company. So that's the way it could be. You know, so when you treat animals kindly, it's good for the animals and it's good for us. When you go to these slaughterhouses and these factory farms, you see animals literally clanking and screaming in their cages to get out. It's a horrible place for the animals. And in some cases, they're put in cages so small they can't even turn around. That's how they live their whole lives. And, you know, the feeling in a place like that is just so ugly. And the air is thick with toxic fumes. The manure is collecting in these cesspools underneath them. And they're in misery, screaming. Working in a place like that, affects the workers too. It's bad for the animals and it's bad for the people. You know, we are social animals. We are affected by our environment. It rubs off on us. Our social environment goes beyond just humans. It includes other animals too. So and at a slaughterhouse, could you imagine what it would be like to work at a slaughterhouse where for 8 hours a day you're cutting the throats of animals? When this happens, you know, you don't look at the animal as a living creature. You look at the animal as a commodity. And that's exactly what happens in factory farms. These animals are looked at as pig baby making machines, for example, or dairy cows are looked at as milk production units, not as living creatures. When they're no longer profitable, they're sent to slaughter, usually at a very young age. For a cow to have milk, she has to have a calf every year. The baby's taken away at birth because that milk can then be sold to people. So this is an industry that has complete disrespect for other animals and disrespect for its own workers and for consumers and for the environment. And each of us can make a choice not to be part of it. We can decide that we want to eat food that is good for us and nourishes us and doesn't cause such harm. And so that's what we're all capable of doing if we decide to do that. And I guess I'll just sort of end it on that. I'll actually make what I was looking for my phone so I could see what time it was. I don't know what time we got. 3:20. So we had about 15 more minutes. I'll end this on a story that I think illustrates how even the most vegan isn't perfect. Because, you know, sometimes as vegans, we can feel pretty righteous. But the reality is, just being human, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to cause harm. We need to live as well as we can. So to me, being vegan is really an aspiration to live as well as possible. You know, but in the case of eating organic produce, for example, if it's grown with animal manure inputs or meat and bone meal from the slaughterhouse or fish meal, is that technically vegan? I don't know. I mean, I will buy organic produce, but you see, these are the kinds of things that are not so simple. And just living, we do cause harm. And so, but it's about changing our relationship with other animals to make it one of respect instead of one of exploitation. That, to me, is really the bottom line. And so that's what we've always tried to do at Farm Sanctuary. And so when we started, we would go into farms and literally find living animals in trash cans or living animals thrown on piles of dead animals. And we started rescuing them. And we would bring these animals to the veterinarian. And veterinarians who work on farm animals are not used to treating individuals. And for them, it's like for the industry, really an economic situation. So if you have an animal that's worth nothing, they've been thrown away and they're very sick, the industry will just discard them and write them off as dead. And veterinarians also would say, well, it's not worth your time. You know, it makes no economic sense. So we had a lot of work to do early on to educate veterinarians about our perception of these animals as individuals who deserve to be treated with compassion and deserve to be given a life, instead of as production units. So that was really the big divide. And I think most people would recognize farm animals are living, feeling creatures. And if we recognize them as that, and not as commodities, what does that mean for our behavior? But so we're over a period of time interacting with veterinarians, and at a certain point they came to accept our point of view that, you know, even if we brought in a sheep that was worth nothing and we paid them a couple $100s to treat the sheep, it was okay. And we were paying our bills too, so that didn't hurt. But they started accepting that, okay, these are sick farm animals and they're paying a lot more than they're worth, but all right. And then we also had a rat on the farm who just used to hang around where we were feeding the animals, and this rat looked pretty sick one day. So we called the vet and said, we got this rat. And, you know, we're pushing him a little bit now, right? And the vet was kind of hemming and hawing on the other end saying, what do you want us to do with the rat? And I said, the rat looks like he's sick, you know, can you just take a look at him? And so the vet finally agreed, and we brought the rat in, and the rat was in bad shape and had to be euthanized. A couple weeks after that, our sheep had worms. They had parasites. So I got one of the worms and I called the vet, and I say, I have this worm here. And there was a very long silence on the other end. And then he sort of, you know, haltingly said, well, what do you want us to do for that worm? And then I explained that the worms were parasites and we needed medicine for the sheep. And And so that's how we proceeded. So essentially there was a line drawn, right? And so just living on this planet, we are going to be interacting with a bunch of different kinds of critters. And, sometimes, there's going to be challenging situations. And so for me, being vegan is an aspiration to live as well as possible, to cause as little harm as possible, to develop relationships with other animals that are based on respect and compassion. And I believe that that approach is not only good for the other animals, but is very good for us and helps us live by our better angels. And that's, I think what we try to do at Farm Sanctuary. And we model a different kind of relationship with animals where they're our friends, not our food. And it is a place where we welcome people to come visit. We actually have something going on here in San Francisco, I think later this month, our Walk for Farm Animals. There's a table outside the door here, so please stop by that and sign up if you're interested and haven't done so yet. And then we have our event up in Orland in November, our celebration for the turkeys that I mentioned before, where, for Thanksgiving they're our guests of honor, and we enjoy being with them while they're alive. And, the celebration for the turkeys in our Adopt a Turkey program really came out of our desire and our need to create something as an alternative to this national holiday that's celebrated around the body of a dead animal. And so Farm Sanctuary has always looked at difficult situations and tried to provide alternatives. So our celebration for the turkeys is that. And eating vegan food and supporting organizations like are here is also part of that. And I just am very that's all right. And I'm just very grateful to be here. To be among so many people who share an interest in living more compassionately and more mindfully. And I guess I'll just close it on that and open it up to questions. So thank you all very much. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
Do you need volunteers?
Do we need volunteers? Oh, yeah. Well, the Walk for Farm Animals is something good to get involved in. And again, there's a table right out there. We have an internship program where people can actually live on the farm and help take care of the animals. So if you go to our website, farmsanctuary.org, there's information on interning. And we might also be doing some things beyond the farms. But another thing you can do, short of, say, volunteering with an organization, is just being sort of an online activist. Sharing videos and sharing information and just helping people to make more compassionate, thoughtful choices. So I think you could volunteer as an intern or in other ways with Farm Sanctuary. But in addition, there are things a person can do just in their daily life to help create a positive difference. Yeah.
I agree with you that, first, thank you for your talk.
Thanks.
And I agree with you that, my question is the ping-ponging back and forth between respecting, like you said, having respect for people, when in fact, deep down, I don't actually respect what's going on.
I understand, yeah.
And so, but that not being a very effective approach to not have respect. We've talked in an earlier lecture today, we talked about smoking, and you brought up slavery, and my favorite quotation by Abraham Lincoln is, "Those who deny others freedom deserve it not themselves." So when we're talking about respect, and the idea that like smoking and maybe even slavery too didn't really shift until there was a stigma attached to it, until it in fact was disrespected to the degree where no one wanted to be caught smoking out in public or having slaves anymore. What would you say to that?
Well, those are very valid points, and I think change happens in various ways. And with slavery, it ultimately took the Civil War, and an evolution of thinking over the course of the Civil War. And then we still had problems, and then the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, and then we still have issues, So it is a challenge when there is an injustice happening and a wrong happening. How do you deal with it? And you want to go in there and say, stop. But then you become a cop. And ultimately, the criminal, for lack of a better way of, framing this, has to change and be reformed. So it's about the actor doing the bad thing, ultimately shifting to changing. Otherwise, you're going to have one cop here and then another cop there, and then you have whoever's got the bigger gun on a particular day wins. Martin Luther King was being urged to be more active, and things weren't changing fast enough, and so he was sort of confronted with this idea, well, sometimes you need violence. And I know that's not what you're saying, violence, but sometimes when an injustice is happening, it seems that that's the way to fix it, is like to get there by force. And Martin Luther King was asked, well, why don't we sometimes step up our tactics and be a little bit more assertive and even violent? And what he said was that there's a couple of reasons why that didn't make sense in his mind. One was that this is a movement based on nonviolence and compassion, and doing that is not aligned with that perspective. And number two, they got much bigger guns than we do, man. We're going to get whooped, So it was sort of a pragmatic and a principled response. And so in terms of why don't you just say it's wrong, from a pragmatic standpoint, it's not very effective. People are going to say, well, forget it. They put up a wall. But from a principled perspective, I think we can't tell people what to do. People ultimately have to make their own choices. And so providing an example, and people learn from each other and rub off on each other. So providing a really good example is one of the best things you can do. They say in parenting, parents with children, if you tell your child to do something, it's not nearly as important as what you do and then watching you do it. So I think that being a good example is critically important. Providing support for positive steps is important. Being honest about your opinions. Not saying, I think it's okay to kill animals. And when people come to me and say, well, I only buy humane, I'll say, well, the word humane and slaughter don't seem to fit very well together. And I'll sometimes also frame it in terms of a question, like, do you think the word humane and slaughter, you've got to be careful how your tonality on this too, of course. But, just getting people to think about these things. Does the word humane and slaughter go together? And, how do you feel about the factory farming industry where they put animals in crates? Sometimes I think when we're talking to others, asking questions is a good technique because it causes people to have to actually think about what they're saying. But, what you raise is sort of an age-old challenge. When there's a wrong happening, how do you stop it? And I think it cannot be stopped with the same energy, violence, for instance, or force, that oftentimes is the root of it. It has to be, a real revolution requires a different approach. And it's not a war again. It's a different kind of revolution, one of inclusion and embracing and encouraging compassionate action. Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, on your sanctuaries, you must have cats hanging around. So,
yeah.
Because I'm vegan, but then I feel like my cat is a carnivore, so I feel like I need to feed her meat, which is sort of like a little bit of a...
Yeah, it's a
where did that meat come from? Some horrible, farm or whatever. So how do you...
Yeah, the point she raises is, what about cats? Like on our farm we might have some, or she has cats and feels like they're carnivores, and I'd say actually it's probably more than you feel like they're carnivores. They are carnivores, and it's a dilemma. It is honestly a dilemma. There are some animals that need to eat meat. Now, some people say cats can be vegan. I've not seen it that much, so I don't think they can. So if they have to eat meat, what do you do? There's no real good answer. So you could maybe try to feed them less meat. Maybe if you could sort of stretch what you feed them with some other things too, that might be helpful to mitigate it a bit. But
there is a vegan cat food that claims that it supplies the cats with all of its needs, and that it's modern and has figured it out. And it's called Mommy Cat, AMI, and it's from Italy.
Okay, so AMI cat might be an option there. Right, Brenda, if you're, hey, look, we share as we go. I don't know either. So so that might be an option. But there are some dilemmas in this world, and you just do the best you can And again, this is where being perfect is not really possible. Did you have something?
I just wanted to include that I've heard that female cats are much more able to adapt the vegan diet, but male cats aren't able to because of some sort of disease that they catch in their urine.
Okay. Oh, cystitis, I think. Yeah. So that's possible. So other comments or thoughts? Yeah.
A problem with overpopulation of animals, like they have babies and they have babies.
Like at our sanctuary? Yeah, she asked about our sanctuaries. Do we ever have a problem with overpopulation of animals? Well, we do not let our animals breed, so we do not have an overpopulation problem. And so in the case of pigs, usually the males are castrated the day they're born on factory farms. So usually they come in and they're not going to be having babies, But if they were not, then we have them neutered. And in the case of birds, we just grab their eggs, which, so that way they can't sit on them, they can't incubate them, and they don't hatch. So there's too many animals now that need homes. So we don't want our animals to be having babies. Now, if they come in pregnant, that's different. We've had animals come in pregnant and they've had babies there, but otherwise we do not allow breeding. So, okay, one more question. Yes?
I do. Thank you so much for your important work.
Sure.
Incredibly important. Well, this is, I think, one of the most difficult times of year for vegans with Thanksgiving approaching. And dealing with families and family gatherings, and we have to make the choice between being with our families that we love and dealing with the dead food as a centerpiece. And I've tried to not have the bird, but I think people are so attached to it. They've done it for some, their life. What are some of the suggestions you might have when I've heard, well, it's a humanely slaughtered animal, or trying to have more vegetables, but yet not removing the bird from the meal?
Yeah. It's an interesting question and a timely one with Thanksgiving coming up, right? Like, what do we do? How do we deal with those challenging family situations where, for us, it's sort of like, for other people, it'd be like having a dead dog in the middle of the table, and that really is painful. So, I mean, making that kind of a comparison might actually help people to understand a little bit just how painful it can be. I also think bringing something as an alternative, like a tofurkey or some kind of vegan turkey substitute is positive. We have an Adopt a Turkey program where, you can bring a picture of the turkey that lives at Farm Sanctuary. This is the kind of turkey I'd rather be spending the day with. Now, you got to be sort of careful about the particular social situation and do what you feel is right. In some cases, a blow-up might be okay. But it might not. It's really situational, and depends on your particular situation with your family and everything, and what you want to say. But you can't control others. You can only control yourself. Is one of my mantras, and you want to ultimately feel, after you've done whatever you've done, good about it. And I think by feeling good about it doesn't necessarily mean putting other people down, but hopefully making people think. And so I'd say bringing food is a good thing. Bringing a picture of a turkey is a good thing. If it's really hard to be there and see the dead bird on the table, maybe eat at a separate table. Or maybe invite people to your place and say, we're having a feast here. And that's a way to sort of take control of the situation. And then somebody's going to probably say, well, what can I bring? Some turkeys? No, I got it all covered. But if they really push it and it's at your house, then I think you can say no. Now, if you're going to their house, I think it's a little different, and you can either go or not go. And if you go, there are ways to potentially mitigate it or raise an issue, but being mindful of what the ultimate long-term consequences are going to be. Blow-ups are generally not the best. I mean, they may have a place. I'm not saying they're always wrong, but you want to ultimately, I think, go side to side with somebody, go forward together instead of conflict and go separate. So to the extent you can go together, seeing a healthier way, more humane way forward, that would be a really good goal to try to achieve. So thank you all very much. I think our time's up. And
Thank you, everyone. And don't forget that Culinary will be showing Cowspiracy. Have you seen it?
yes, it's excellent. Cowspiracy is very good.
Movie,
Yeah.